Barrie faces a housing crisis. It's ranked in the top 10 of Canada's most expensive housing markets, and it has the fourth highest rental rates in Canada. And that's all with COVID-19 driving up house prices and rental prices even higher. Amidst all this, the city does have a housing strategy with a goal of 840 affordable housing units by 2024. And there's been multiple projects in the works in Barrie that seem to work towards that goal. Coral Sophia Lane Housing proposed a 108 unit apartment building on Bayfield Street, for example, and 70 of those units are set to be affordable. And while that is a definable term, affordable housing, it's a term which just scratches the surface of a whole bunch of policy choices at the municipal, provincial, and federal level, which have made it so difficult for people who are unhoused or living rough in Barrie to find housing solutions. The housing crisis really has an outsized impact on Barrie's marginalized communities. As Barrie City Council discusses affordable housing, supportive housing, and ways in which we can help all people in Barrie find a place to live, we wanted to get a little bit of background about how the conversation has been unfolding. And there's lots of organizations in Barrie that are doing work in this field. I spoke with Jennifer Van Gennip. She's a housing rights advocate and Director of Communications with Redwood Park Communities. She's also the chair of Simcoe County Alliance to End Homelessness. We speak about affordable housing, navigating the systems of housing support, and how viewing the issue of housing through a different lens might help us work towards more equitable solutions.
My name is Jennifer Van Gennip, and I work at Redwood Park Communities. I'm the Director of Communications there. And through that role, I have also become involved in the Simcoe County Alliance to End Homelessness, where I am now the chair of the Barrie chapter. And I'm also involved in the Poverty Reduction Task Group as well for Simcoe County.
And when we talk about Barrie and housing, I feel like the term housing crisis often comes up. And for a lot of people, including me, that the term, like I seem to know, or I think I know what the term means, but when I actually dig into it, there's a whole bunch of underlying issues behind that. And so Barrie's vacancy rate, I think in 2021 was at like 2.1%. Many say we're in a housing crisis. I was wondering, could you kind of give a really brief or a background in whatever way you think is best about what a housing crisis actually means and what kind of factors contribute to that in Barrie?
That's a big question. Yeah. So I would say we are in a housing crisis. I think that maybe the term crisis gets thrown around enough now that it's kind of lost its impact. But we have a lot of people who can't really afford the housing they're in, or who can't afford housing at all. So the definition of affordable housing is that housing is 30% of your household income spent on your housing expenses. And that would include your rent, or it could include your mortgage and your property taxes and your utilities and maintenance, right? So that's not easy to do in Barrie. Obviously, our rents are some of the highest in the country, and we have a bit of a stock problem, an affordable housing stock problem. One of the problems with the way we talk about affordable housing is we've kind of individualized it, like people can't afford the houses in this market. A symptom of a bigger system problem where wages have been suppressed and real estate has become an investment, right? It's not just a basic need, it's considered an investment. You buy a house to invest your wealth and to grow your wealth. And it's so in that way, it's become more of an asset. And when that has been allowed to increase so much, I'm not an economist at all, but my understanding of the way that we have allowed housing based on credit, not based on the amount of money people have, okay, but based on the amount of credit that people are able to access, housing prices have risen they have completely outpaced wages. And so that gap between what you can afford and how much housing costs is really a policy and a systems problem. It's not so much, it's not that, I mean, I don't know, I can't even think how many times I've heard people say millennials just need to learn how to budget or something like that. But that's not really the root of what's happening here. Like you're talking about our vacancy rate, it's ridiculously low. It's fiercely competitive, and landlords are able, so in the renting market, landlords are able to be extremely choosy and price. I mean, we're used to seeing bidding wars in housing to buy a house. We're seeing bidding wars in renting. We're seeing rentals go above asking price. So yeah, there's a stock problem, and there's also just this gap between what people can afford and where the housing prices are sitting. That's a lot. I don't know if that really answered your question.
I found that really clear. And as you mentioned,
Okay.
like, I suppose to really answer the question, you'd need like a 200,000 word thesis,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I think that's a really clear explanation. And
Okay.
I was thinking, I live at home with my parents because of some of the reasons you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
but as well from my reading of your publications that I've read and stuff too. We all know that this problem kind of disproportionately affects a lot of the marginalized people in Barrie, and it's in many ways a cyclical issue based in, as you mentioned too, systemic and policy issues.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about how you see the issue of affordable housing kind of impact Barrie's most vulnerable or marginalized communities?
First thing that I would point out is that the definition of affordable housing.
Yeah.
So everybody kind of has an idea. A lot of people aren't really clear on exactly what it is, but there is a very well defined definition, and it's this 30%. But then there's another piece to that definition. It's considered 30% of a low to moderate income household's income. Except low to moderate household is also a defined term. And when I'm speaking a defined term, I mean in the provincial policy statements for Ontario. It's similar in other provinces, but specifically in Ontario, it's defined in the provincial policy statement, which is a wide, broad reaching piece of policy that is meant for development. It's not really meant for social service policy, but because the definition exists in that important policy piece, it leaks into our social policy as well. So low to moderate household income is defined as the 60th percentile. So most people don't know what it means, but most of us assume it means like average or below average. Low to moderate, we would think it would mean below average. But what it actually means is, so if average is 50%, it's the 60th percent. So every year or so, the province puts out a table of what that 60th percentile is in the different regions of Ontario. And so for Simcoe Muskoka, or for Simcoe County, it's $92,000 a year as a household income. So that means you should be able to affordable. The definition of affordable is anything that comes in around, I think it's $2,250 a month. That and everything under that is considered affordable. So we have programs to subsidize the development of affordable housing. As long as you are under that threshold, you qualify for subsidies. Now, of course, even the average rent isn't actually that high for one bedrooms, even in Simcoe County. So the other part of that definition is or average market rent. So whichever is lower. So 2250 or average market rent, whichever is lower. So what happens is you have all these government subsidies, unless you're very careful, you have all of these government subsidies being poured into building apartments and housing at average market rent, which doesn't help a lot of people, obviously. So again, it comes into this gap because if you're experiencing homelessness, or a lot of folks who are very precariously housed fall into pretty much the lowest level of social assistance that you can receive is as a single person. Ontario works with no special considerations. So that person gets $390 a month for housing. That's their housing allowance within their Ontario Works. There's a little bit more money in there for things like groceries and transportation and things like that, but the housing allowance piece is $390. You can't even rent a room in a rooming house for $390 in this town. So part of the issue around homelessness and the impacts around homelessness, it's an income piece. It's the same as before, what we were talking about before. It's an income piece, but it very specifically, you're talking about people who have $390, maybe $400 a month for their housing needs, and a market where a one-bedroom apartment is going for $1,300, $1,400, $1,500, and even a rooming house is often $600 a month.
So that kind of support doesn't get people even halfway towards the bare minimum.
No, not at all. So then you see living in encampments, for example, and even when we went into the encampments, in some cases we would say, we can get you first and last month's rent through the housing retention fund or whatever. We can arrange first and last month's rent for you in a rooming house. Would you like to come inside in a rooming house? And they would say, first and last month's rent, but I can't, that's not sustainable for me. It's nice that you're going to give me first and last month's rent. That's helpful to an extent, but there's still a lot of barriers. I still have to do a credit check. I still have I don't have good references. All those pieces are still a barrier for me. And then first and last month, and then I'm going to be out anyways because I can't sustain that on $390 a month. And it would take all my money. It would take all my food money. If I used all my money, I could afford $600. But I'd honestly, at this point, rather live outside and have money to buy food and, whatever else than I have at least. If you're not inside, you don't get that $390. You can get the rest of your Ontario Works. So you have a little bit of money for food and basic needs, but you only get that $390 if you are paying rent or something like that.
You can only get the $395 if you're paying rent, but it's almost impossible to see how someone could pay rent anywhere with that sort of assistance.
Yeah, so we have rent supplements because this is a well-known gap. And so we have rent supplements, but they're tricky too because they're often waitlisted. It's not an empty, it's not a never, and on a bottomless bucket of rent supplements. You may have heard there was recently announced, they talked about it for about 2 years before it actually came in, but there were these Canadian Ontario portable housing benefits, COBs. So Canadian Ontario Housing Benefits, COBs. And they were touted as this really great thing that was going to move a lot of people off the wait list. However, what's happened is around the same time that they came into effect, an Ontario rent supplement that lots of households were already on was expiring. So in Simcoe County, we just took a bunch of people on an expiring rent supplement and used this new one to just continue their support. So as soon as it was announced, it was waitlisted again. So we have very long wait lists for rent supplements. And sometimes what happens is you can have a rent supplement here, but some of our rent supplements have rules around them. So some of them don't and some of them do. So if they're from the Ministry of Health, for example, if it's through the mental health funding envelope, there are less restrictions around the price of the monthly rent that you can use for your rent, that you can use your rent supplement for. But if it's through the Ministry of Children's Social Services, then it can only be used on a unit that's already been deemed affordable. So if average market rent is $1,400 and you find an apartment for $1,425, you can't use your rent supplement to secure that apartment because it doesn't meet the threshold of what you can use a rent supplement in. So sometimes we even have people who have rent supplements and can't find an apartment even with the rent supplement.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
There's a lot of problems in how we're trying to go about this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, that a rent supplement is a good way to increase affordable housing stock because you can take, in theory, if you can take any apartment and make it affordable by supplementing the rent, then that is probably cheaper than building new apartment buildings, for example. But when the rent supplement, when there's too many barriers to using the rent supplement in our current rental market, then our hands are tied and we can't help people. It's very disheartening for a housing access worker to not be able to put someone in an apartment over a $25 difference, for example. And it happens regularly.
And I was wondering, when you talked a while ago about the definition, the legislative definition of affordable housing, and how that in itself presents so many barriers, it seems like, to people that want to be housed and have that right. When we talk about supportive housing, is there a similar sort of legislative definition or a way of talking about what supportive housing is and what supportive housing isn't?
Supportive housing is actually a very broad term as well, because it can include housing for people with physical or developmental disabilities. It's not just about people who are experiencing homelessness. Like when we talk about it, we tend to just be talking about it in the sense around homelessness. But I also work with the Down Syndrome Association, and I also have a son with autism. So I'm familiar with the side. There are also large wait lists on the side of supportive housing that looks a little bit different. It's around people with developmental or physical disabilities who need slightly different supports to be independent, in like a level of independently housed, depending on their needs. Yeah. So that is also, from the province's perspective, quite a broad definition.
On your website, you mentioned you wanted to lead a shift in your colleagues and in the people that work in your field towards a justice approach to your work rather than a charity approach. I was wondering, when we discuss supportive housing in Barrie, specifically the proposed like Vespra Street location, how would it look to approach it with a justice approach rather than a charity approach?
Okay, wow, I didn't know you'd seen my website. So yes, I am very interested on a personal level in pushing us towards a justice lens. So we're talking about that at Redwood. We're having some conversations about that in the broader community, for sure, about what that looks like. Because the philosophy that we're working in is called housing first. So that's a philosophy where you get your housing, and then you can work on stabilizing. You don't have to earn your housing. Housing is a right. So we will provide you with choice of housing, and then you can choose to come into housing that suits your needs. And then you can set goals yourself of what you may or may not want to address in your life, if there are some certain cycles that you want to break, or some habits that you want to break, but they're very much self-determined. So for me, as I'm working, and this is of course an evolution for all of us, we're all kind of evolving the more we know. But when I look at it from a justice lens, housing is a right, full stop. And then my new lens that I like, since you've asked, is, does this intervention that we're proposing, does it honor and center a person's self-determination, autonomy, dignity, and self-inclusion? If it doesn't, how can we change it so that it does? And that is a challenge when you're talking about house rules or even evaluation outcomes, how we're going to evaluate if this has been a success. Because they need to be metrics that have been determined by the people that we're serving, that we're supporting. And we can't say, even the development of those evaluation metrics have to be centered around those principles. And I think it's really important that we don't put our expectations of what a successful, we used to say housing first is an approach where you give someone the housing and then the supports to keep them successfully housed. And then we even said, what does that even mean? Let's say sustainably housed, because the idea of what success means can look very different, and my ideas could look very different from a different person, from the person that I'm trying to help. So those are my 4 words. And social inclusion feels like it doesn't fit, maybe, but what we're seeing is that the longer a person is in homelessness, the more they feel othered and like they're not part of society. And so we're seeing people who have experienced homelessness, they can move into housing and they still identify as homeless because it's become part of their identity. So for me, that brings up 2 things. One is we need to get people back into housing as quickly as possible so that that's not another thing that they have to overcome. And also the social inclusion piece is so important to include in whatever interventions we're putting forward. And that doesn't just fall on the social service agencies, and it certainly doesn't fall to the individual. That's actually something that as a society, I think we can work on, is this social inclusion of people, whether they're housed or unhoused.
And yeah, so as you mentioned, it's kind of it seems very logical to me that someone's housing and the right to have a roof over your head is a right? And I suppose in Barrie, specifically, I'm thinking of the petition from a lady who works in Huntsville who took up a petition opposing the Vespera Street supportive housing project. You do see a lot of people that it seems to me that they seem to place the right to housing on someone's even appearance or the perception of what they may be like. What This is another huge question, which is kind of unfair, but what steps do you think Barrie can take, and that our political leaders, as well as organizations, the media, to kind of make supportive housing or kind of depoliticizing it? Because it seems like from everything you're saying that it is a human rights issue, right? It's not, it shouldn't really be an issue where the people can debate people's right to have a safe place to live.
Absolutely.
Are there ways to kind of move towards kind of creating a more ethical conversation around it?
There are a few. I don't know if any of them are fixes, but
Yeah.
there are a few things come to mind when you ask. One is sort of at the planning level, zoning. So Barrie is moving in this new official plan, at least the drafts that I've seen. They're moving towards zoning where residential means residential, and so you don't have to go to your neighbors and have a big community consultation about whether certain kinds of residential developments can happen in certain areas. So, and I'm not a planner either, so I might have messed that up, but the gist of it is, several years ago, there was a shift in planning legislation. You can't zone for people. You can zone for buildings, but you can't zone for people. And actually, in this guide for municipal planners and human rights, for municipal planners to follow human rights and honor human rights, it said if you replace the word in the sentence, whoever you don't want to move in, replace it with the Greeks or Polish people. And if it sounds ridiculous and offensive to say, no, we certainly don't need any more Greek people here, or we certainly wouldn't want any more Greek people in our neighborhood, then you absolutely can't say that about whatever other kind of people that you're talking about moving into the development or into the neighborhood or whatever. So that's a little litmus test for people, which I thought was kind of funny and also very useful. So the city is moving towards inclusion. I think it's called inclusionary zoning, I think.
Oh, okay.
Where you don't need neighbors' permission, basically, to create housing for different populations, including marginalized populations. And then another thing is, I think it's about humanizing it. And I think what you do, I think is very important because it's about telling people's stories. So part of the reason that people are worried about whatever population you're talking about, those people, whoever those people are in this scenario. I think part of it is it's an unknown, right? And we're afraid of what we don't know. So the more we can recognize our shared, it sounds corny, but our shared humanity with people, because the reality is any one of us could end up in this housing market, in this housing market, in this market, period. This job market, this housing market, just the society. We have a lot less, there are a lot more people who are precariously housed and or precariously employed and or don't have strong family ties close to them, right? Maybe your parents live across the country, or maybe you don't have any siblings, or so your safety net is much weaker as well, right? So any one of us could find ourselves in a pretty tough spot. And I like to say, when people, once you're outside, like once you've lost your housing, it unravels really quickly. You're not getting enough sleep. I'm awful. Like if I haven't had sleep or lunch or both, I'm awful. I had twins, so I was sleep deprived for a while. And I was having out of body experiences as I watched myself rage at my family sometimes, just because you just lose reason, you lose logic, you lose good judgment. So imagine having lost everything, um, and then you haven't slept in 3 days, you haven't eaten in a day or two. You already feel othered. Like you basically already feel like you don't really belong as part of society. So a lot of those norms, those social norms about how you would behave, are starting to slip away too. You haven't showered. Very quickly, any one of us could become less polite or less, all the things that we accuse people who are experiencing homelessness of being. Any one of us could slip into that very quickly.
Yeah,
I think that's important.
yeah, it seems like it kind of relates back to when you like the discussion about affordable housing too, because I guess if you are a person who may not be informed about the issue or have thought about it that much, and you think about it as a personal failing, as soon as you start going into the situation thinking like that, then if you think like, oh, they should get a job, well, if someone gets a job at any minimum wage position in Barrie, there's still nowhere for them really to live, right, if they don't have those strong family ties. So it's, as you're saying, right, it's such a structural thing, and it's not, it kind of, you got to shift away the view from looking at it as like a personal failing almost. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's absolutely what I'm saying. I think we all were a little, I think that news story a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, of the PSWs who were living in a shelter in Ottawa, and there was a COVID outbreak in a shelter in Ottawa, and it was traced back to these, nobody even knew. They were PSWs, they were working in long-term care homes and sleeping at the shelter because their PSW jobs did not pay them enough. They'd lost their housing. They couldn't afford the rent, and they were sleeping in a shelter as PSWs. And that is, I think that helps jolt people a little bit into the reality of where we are right now when it comes to precarious work and precarious housing, and how they are connected and feed off of each other, I guess.
And I want to be mindful of your time, but I was thinking, looking forward in Barrie's future, and there is population requirements that are kind of laid out by the province that Barrie has to hit. And a lot of councillors and council decisions have kind of led towards concentrating a lot of development in the downtown with large condo buildings. The issue of housing, affordable housing in Barrie, kind of moving forward into the next decade. What are some of the key decisions that you're going to be looking to, or what are some of the pivotal kind of choices or things kind of moving it forward in Barrie's future that you think are going to be really key in this crisis?
It's that's true. So a lot of it is stock. So how can I say? Well, we've put forward some suggestions to city staff as they're working on the official plan. So our suggestions from the SCATEH Barrie chapter, I should say, our suggestions were around protecting existing affordable stock and creating new affordable stock, because that's really where the city can't do much about minimum wage. But what is in their control is what we focused on. So, and it sounds like that's what your question is. Obviously, the province should change minimum wage, and there should be some, and also minimum wage, but also that social assistance amount, that income piece, whether it's from wages or from social assistance, that all needs to come up drastically. But then what the city has control of, around creating affordable stock and protecting existing stock. So we've talked to them about, they can't change the provincial definition of affordable housing, but they could create a sub-definition within that, and that we're suggesting, that is more targeted towards actual low-income households. And we're suggesting maybe like calling it deeply affordable or something like that, so that they can target some of their incentives to that definition. We've also made some suggestions around policies that we're seeing in other cities and even in other countries around first right of refusal, when buildings come up, like either old schools or really any kind of building that could be converted into affordable housing or land, that the city could have first right of refusal on those kinds of buildings. Montreal is the example that comes to mind. They're already doing some good work around zoning. What else? We had a few, we had a few suggestions. How to protect from, putting in some policies that would protect from REIT, how do you say rights? REIT, like the real estate investment funds that will come in, and especially in something like COVID, you see some mom and pop landlords not being able to keep up with their expenses, because if people aren't able to pay their rent, then sometimes landlords can't pay their expenses. So you can see large conglomerates come in and buy up the affordable housing stock, and then the rent can go up without any improvements, like just under new ownership or whatever. You can end up losing your affordable housing stock that way. So we are suggesting some policies from other, I don't remember the details of it, to be honest, but other policies from other cities that we have sort of said, hey, this is what they're doing here to protect against that kind of thing. So there are a few things that they can do that we've sent them some details on, different policies. Recognizing housing as a right, I think, would probably also be a good thing. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden the city is held liable for anyone who doesn't have housing. It doesn't mean that anyone who doesn't have housing can sue the city. It just means that they're dedicated to committing to realizing that in as right in as short a time as possible, so that adequate budget and adequate resources are being put towards that goal. There's more about that on the SCATEH website under advocacy. We have a position paper about that if you wanted to see more there.
I'll check that out. And it seems like from what you're saying, that kind of pivotal mindset shift of recognizing housing as a right could go a long way in terms of how the discussion even happens, right, in Barrie.
I think so. In a way, moving from a charity lens to a justice lens, it kind of changes nothing and everything at the same time. So you still do a lot of the same things, but the reason that you're doing them, when you have that shift, it just moves. When you move from, I want you to have housing because it is your right as a human being, from I want you to have housing because I am a nice person, and so I am going to work on this on your behalf. It kind of shifts. It is a shift.